morning to everyone who has decided to join this webinar. It is a webinar. Today's topic is on blended finance. So my name is Knut Lakså. I'm head of programs at Future Horizons Institute, which is a Norwegian-based think tank on global issues and sustainable development. And this webinar is part of a series of webinar that we run on various topics on critical issues for sustainable development. It's being co-hosted by Nordic, which is our partner in crime for this event. Nordic is, and some of you may know them because they changed the name some time ago. It was previously called Nordic Microfinance Initiative, a public-private partnership that invests in and builds up companies in Africa and Asia, focusing on financial services to low-income households. And they have a wide array of both public and private investors. So before we start, I just want to mention, to be GDPR compliant, that this meeting will be recorded. And we hope to disseminate it to people who, for some reason, cannot join today's discussion. But with me today, I will not do most of the talking. I will convene a very distinguished panel of three experts in this field, representing government, policy, the private sector, and research, to dive into the topic of today. So first, I would like to introduce you to the State Secretary for International Development from the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Mrs. Bjorg Sandkjaer. She's been in the State Secretary since 2021, and before that has a long track record in international development, particularly global health, human rights, aid effectiveness, and has worked for many different organizations, NORAD, Gavi, Vaccine Alliance, and so on. Secondly, I would like to introduce Mr. Arthur Sletteberg. He is the CEO of Nordic. He has also a very distinguished and long CV, and I won't delve into all of it, but sufficient to say that he has a long experience from both private and public sector, having worked for large investors such as Færdas and Oslo Pensjonsforsikring, DNB, Storebrand, and the Norwegian Central Bank. And thirdly, Ms. Elisabeth Fosseli Olsen. She is a researcher from University of Oslo, and she is also part of the Future Horizons Institute. She is studying, for the time being, researching at TIC Center for Technology, Innovation and Culture at the University of Oslo, and has a long track record in international development. But her current research is focusing on impact investments and blended finance, with a particular focus on Tanzania. So I believe with these three very competent and distinguished experts on this topic, we will have a quite interesting discussion throughout the day. But before we start, I just want to maybe remind people, I think most people know what blended finance is, but it is basically the use of public funds to attract private investments for projects with a social and environmental impact. And especially in emerging markets or developing countries, there's a huge discussion on this. And the whole sort of basic idea behind blended finance is basically that you can de-risk investments for private investors and kind of catalytically trigger more funds for projects and investments that can contribute to the SDGs within various areas. So the huge discussion, as I'm sure that most of the participants know, is really how can this be done, in what way? And this is what we're going to dive a bit into during this discussion, because even though it holds a great promise in terms of private and public sector working towards common goods jointly, it's also quite challenging. It is a collaboration, but making it work in practice is not an easy task. And this is what we're trying to address a little bit during this webinar. So without further ado, I think we should dive straight into the topic at hand. And my first question goes to you, Bjorg, representing the government here in this meeting. Why is the Norwegian government placing such or greater emphasis on blended finance now? And could you say a little bit about what kind of factors are actually driving this shift? Over to you, Bjorg.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Knut, and thank you to the organizers for bringing us together on a very timely topic and an interesting and important topic. You mentioned the SDGs. Now, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, our global action plan, has a financing gap of more than 4,000 trillion US dollars. The gap in financing our mutual plan, which we have agreed that when we reach the goals by 2030, is way off track. And for every year when we get the new estimates of the financing gap, it has increased. And that means for us, as a big donor to development assistance, we provide more than 1% of our GNI, our gross national income, to development assistance. We just see that even if we provide what we can, and if other in the donor community provide what they can, we're still far from being able to plug the financing gap. So for that reason, and also because we believe that private sector investments and the kind of tools that blended finance can bring to the table are important in themselves, we are looking at how can we make sure that the funding that we spend is spent as makes as much change as possible, and we're looking into ways to spend that funding in ways that multiplies the financing, and again helps us on that progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And to do that, the message is very clear. And we have, of course, it's not new, but the message is becoming more and more clear that we need to mobilize private capital and bridge that gap between the development finance that we as a government can provide and commercial finance. So we do recognize that importance of leveraging private sector resources as that critical partner in addressing development challenges. So our partnership over the years with the private sector has taken many forms. We can fund early stage feasibility studies, we can fund strategic value chain partnerships, we can support accelerators on the African continent or other Latin American continent, other continents, providing first loss facilities for partial risk sharing, and all of these up to the recent state guarantee scheme for renewable energy in countries of the global south that we've just launched, and where the first round of proposals is just now being processed to see which ones will be successful. So we are more involved in blended finance for a couple of reasons, just to sum up, that we see that we need to look for good partnerships where we can spend that government financing in a way that leverages private sector finance to help move us all towards the Sustainable Development Goals that we all agree on. And let me just actually add a final message that's been very clear as I travel and listen to private sector and partners, in particular on the African continent. For example, at the annual meeting of the African Development Bank 1.5 years ago, the topic for the whole meeting was how to leverage private sector financing. The message was very clear from our partners at that meeting, that the private sector is ready to invest, but they were looking to us as government for two things. One was to de-risk investments, take down some of the high risk, perceived or real, that is present if you're investing in on the African continent. And the second very strong message was a need for more what they call bankable projects. So we take that message very seriously and see how we can step up our efforts to help again, work with the private sector to leverage that massive financial and technical muscle in that sector to help us achieve development.
Thank you, Bjorg. I think we all feel, or from what you're saying, it seems like the Norwegian government and donors in general may be stepping up a bit efforts on this. Before continuing, I just want to inform the participants here that you will not be able to participate by voice, but we do have a Q&A, the possibility to post questions or comments. And we will, by the end of this webinar, try to pick up on whether you have questions. So please feel free to post during the entire webinar, and we'll get back to that towards the end of this webinar. Apologies for not informing from the start. But Bjorg, I wanted also to hear a bit from you, because we know, at least Norwegians, we are aware of that the Norwegian government recently launched a new Africa strategy. And how do you see this? And it touches on many various topics regarding sort of Norwegian collaboration with the African continent. But could you say a bit about specifically how you see this strategy aligning with the broader kind of sustainable development financing agenda, and blended finance in particular?
Absolutely. We saw the need to develop a new Africa strategy, as we also see Norway's relationship with African countries and with the African region as a whole as evolving. So if we put it very simply, evolving from a relationship of development assistance into a broader partnership, which involves private sector investment as well as a lot stronger collaboration on the political side. So I'll dive into the private sector bit, because that's what we are more interested in today. And the new Africa strategy does emphasize enhancing innovative financing mechanisms, again, to promote resource mobilization and to promote private investment in African countries. So I mentioned the clear message we heard that we need to focus on risk capital, so that's in the strategy. We also include lending and guarantee schemes directed at sustainable African businesses, at job creation, as well as investment in the green transition. In the strategy is also to prioritize mobilizing private investments to complement ODA, so that's development assistance, particularly in sectors such as clean energy, in agriculture, and in technology. And we do believe that by leveraging Norway's expertise in those areas, the strategy supports African transition to sustainable energy systems. Finally, the strategy also emphasizes cooperation on development finance through multilateral institutions, again aligned with a drive internationally for more coordinated and more effective development financing through international frameworks. And we should also be very, very clear that the strategy also emphasizes locally led development and country ownership. We see a shift in the whole development community, again, responding to very, very strong messages from our partners, in particular on the African continent, to shift some of the decision making and make sure that we respond to local priorities and local leadership in development. And we know that that's so central to sustainable development financing. So our aim is that this approach also ensures that development efforts are tailored to local needs and priorities.
Thank you, Bjorg. I think there are many things to pick up and talk more and dive more into the details of what you just mentioned. But I think for now, this was a good overview, I think. And I would like to maybe take us over to Arthur and to hear a little bit how reality looks like from private sector perspective. Because Nordic, you have more than 15 years of experience in actually investing in quite challenging markets, I would say. Could you say a little bit about, what are you trying to achieve in these countries, and how is this aligning with the goals of your investors, both public but also in particular maybe the private investors that channel funds through Abler Nordic?
Thanks, Knut. Yes, you're right. We are launched as a public-private partnership way back in 2008, actually. So this issue, this topic of blended finance and cooperation between the private and public sector is part of our DNA, to use that term. And our arena has been from the start to build sustainable financial institutions, very much like we did in Northern Europe, in Scandinavia, 150 years ago, building up savings banks to address local needs. That we are trying to replicate, in a sense, in developing countries. And we have recently also added activities in the climate sector, being very active in Indonesia now with a project. Maybe we'll touch upon that later on. But impact is, of course, extremely important for us. And we have 5 goals specified. That's firstly, it's financial access, because we are all about providing good and reliable financial services to low-income households that are not usually seen as attractive clients for the ordinary financial institutions in the countries where they live. So that's the first point, financial access. Ensure that they also can have access to the financial services that we all need, whether you're rich or poor. Second is to help build financial resilience. For us, it's key not only to provide credit, but the way we want to address resilience is to make borrowers into savers. That's the ultimate success. If people have a little dry powder in reserve when they are hit by detrimental effects from climate or from the economy or whatever. Thirdly, we want to increase the income and quality of life of our clients, and we measure this, of course. We also need to address the climate adaptation and mitigation issues that are very, very dramatic, plays out in a dramatic way for many of our clients. They are hard hit by the climate changes that we see all around the globe nowadays. And finally, food security is a key arena for us. And so these of course, these 5 items that we want to pursue on the impact side has not been, not something we have cooked up, so to speak, in splendid isolation. It's in close cooperation with our existing investors and stakeholders. So to respond to your question, how this addresses the interests or corresponds to the interest of our investors, my response is that this has been created in cooperation with them. It's important, you know, in the private sector, we can come back to that, I guess, but they need to see documentation. It's important to see the actual numbers. So on these arenas, we follow closely and measure. And we use tools like 60 decibels that many of you might be familiar with. There's an institution that takes up surveys among thousands and thousands and thousands, tens of thousands actually, of our clients to see how their lives have been affected, both in positive and eventually also in negative senses from the services that we provide.
I thank you, Arthur. And from what you're saying, you know, you seem to be very well aligned with what is coming from Bjorg and what has been stated in terms of SDGs and creating sort of positive social and environmental impact. But at the same time, you're working with private sector, and there is a difference between public money and private money. And the reason we're here today is really also to talk a little bit about and touch what is challenging about this type of collaboration. So I was wondering if you could give us a little bit insight from your experience. What is it that, how are you able actually to give confidence to private investors that they give you their money and you do their investments in very challenging contexts and eventually with clients that are not seen as very attractive locally. They are, many of them, previously unbankable. What is it that you do, and what really gives confidence to make this kind of investment coming from the private sector?
No, it's, I mean, to take your last point first, I mean, it's scary, isn't it? I mean, we are providing financial services, giving long-term loans to clients that the local financial institutions might not be willing to touch with a 10-foot pole, right? And we venture in there with money from both the public sector and the private sector investors in Scandinavia. As an example, we provide 8 or 10-year loans now to farmers, smallholder farmers on the island of Borneo, in order to preserve, together to find ways to preserve the rainforest there. I mean, no Indonesian financial institution is willing to do that. They have their reasons for that. They're not stupid. But I think on a positive note, the alignment and the commitment to help reach the SDGs is very strong also among the more sophisticated private sector players, also in the financial sector. I mean, they want to contribute. That's the starting point. That said, and you touched upon it, they have fiduciary responsibilities. They're not managing necessarily their own money. Some family offices are managing their own money, but most of them have a fiduciary responsibility. They might be pension funds, for instance. They cannot play around with the money at their according to their own liking. They have to ensure that they make decent financial returns. Not exorbitant returns, but decent financial returns for their clients, for their customers who have entrusted them with their money. So that's in that balance we live. I think one reason why we have been able to attract investments from the private sector players is that they trust us. They've been with us for a long time, and they know what we're trying to achieve, and they see the results for themselves, both financially and impact-wise. I mean, it's one feature of Nordic is that actually the investors, they are manning our investment committees that make the ultimate decision about where to invest and how. And of course, they have an intimate knowledge of what's happening, because that's reported to them. But so the level of trust we have been able to reach is important, and that takes time. And secondly, I would also say that active ownership is something that they're looking for. If you are very detached, if you invest in hundreds of investees in developing countries, that's something that is not appealing to the kind of private sector investors that we try to attract, because they want us to be closely following up on what's happening. And thirdly, of course, the attractiveness of the blended finance has been important to the private sector, and we have been fortunate in having a great cooperation with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and NORAD and other public sector entities in Norway, and they have provided, for instance, a foreign exchange facility and a technical assistance facility that have both been absolutely crucial for us when we try to encourage private sector players to make the brave step of investing in sub-Saharan Africa, in Indonesia, in India, That has been very important. So that's the 3 factors I would highlight here.
Yeah. I was actually planning to ask this question: how in practice do you provide this confidence? What kind of instruments? And you already addressed that. And I guess, you know, private sector is very much about measuring risk or assessing risk before making an investment. And as you said, it brings confidence when you have this kind of governmental support and you have some mechanisms designed to reduce that risk. But could you also, my last question to you, could you say, because, you know, you have perceived risk and you have real risk. And I was wondering, and of course, there's a mix of real barriers and real risks that may hinder investors going into these kind of quite challenging markets. But there are also maybe some misconceptions and misperceptions more on the perceived side of these risks. Could you say just a little bit about how you see this? You know, what are the main misconceptions and barriers towards enabling these type of private investments into developing countries?
Yes, I think my key message here, Knut, is that we need to be sober and we need to be nuanced when you're talking about risks in developing markets. I think it's a little dangerous. The litany you hear all the time is that private sector investors, they are too conservative, too shy to invest in emerging markets. The risk is much less in practice than what they perceive. Well, that's not always true. I think we need to be sober about that. We think the emerging markets, there's an enormous diversity there when it comes to countries and people and institutions. So you cannot say bluntly that the risk is low. I mean, it can in some pockets and large pockets even it's modest and for us it has proven to be manageable, and that's important. And to give you a favorite example about FX risk, that's in our experience, that's really a turnoff for very many private sector investors. How, if you are an investment director at a pension fund in Denmark, for instance, or in Sweden or in Germany for that matter, I mean, your instinct, your gut instinct is to hate FX risk. How do you assess the FX risk in Zambia? Or in Indonesia? It's a black box. It's a loose cannon on deck in their framework, in their way of thinking. We, thanks to the FX facility that has been provided to us by the Norwegian government, we have been open. We have not covered our FX risks now for more than a decade. And you might think, when we're doing investments in developing countries, and you might think that has resulted in exorbitant losses from FX. Well, the aggregate loss is $16,000.
Yeah.
And that has enabled us to provide local currency financing to a whole range of financial institutions, small, vulnerable financial institutions in developing countries. And that you can imagine what kind of a blessing that has been to those institutions, not being forced to borrow in dollars and euros. Yeah. So this is, the risk is there. I think we need to be, but it can be managed. And there are reasons why the private sector is a little reluctant, and we need to understand that and address it. And not simply with a broad, just brush it away, because that will not appeal to them. You need to provide tangible solutions to the concerns that they have.
Yeah, Thank you, Arthur. And just to for those not familiar with when you say FX, it's foreign currency exchange risk, and the risk of losing money by exchanging money. So you have in practice a kind of insurance scheme internally to cover those losses covered by the government.
Sorry about that. Tribal language.
No. This is fine. I'm just thinking maybe not everyone in the audience is familiar with this term. This brings me, thank you so much, Arthur. This brings me over to Elisabeth. I mean, you are a researcher and you have dived into this topic of blended finance and doing really in-depth study with a long fieldwork in Tanzania to look at really how this plays out in practice. And I think we're very eager to hear a bit from you. What are your kind of initial findings? How does this play out and really look like at the very sort of ground level where these investments are supposed to happen?
Thank you so much, Knut. So yes, I'm on my third year of doing what's called an industrial PhD. So I'm doing it after 25 years in the field as a part of my work to look really into what are we doing out there. So it's great coming back to academia, and what I'm studying is early stage investments into startups. So that's kind of my core area, but I do of course look at the larger picture as well, but that will be kind of my entrance here. And what we see is that in developing countries like Tanzania or the least developed countries, only 12% of blended finance partnerships takes place in these countries. And it's probably not a very big surprise because these countries do not have financial markets in the same way as we find in Silicon Valley or in Oslo, for that sake, or in Silicon Savannah in Nairobi. So it's a very different markets we are talking about. And I wanted to look into how can investments and finance suddenly be a tool for poverty eradication in the least developed countries. And just to give you 3 examples of how this takes place in a country like Tanzania, before I come with some recommendations maybe for the conversation. So what I found is that because there is next to no capital in circulation in countries like Tanzania, development actors, they design finance-like programs, which they call accelerators, investments. They kind of imitate finance to be a place where startups and entrepreneurs can come for getting funding and competence to grow their companies. The problem here is twofold. And one is that it's not finance, it's development. So they're actually turning finance into development by using finance slogan. And to a certain degree, that's fine, but you don't have the investment, right? There's no long-term commitment. It's only the grant cash for maybe half a year. And what they also do is to connect these to SDGs, which are related to their own mandates. So, for example, 1 year, the entrepreneur needs to have a product that is solving sexual reproductive health rights. The next year, it's about gender equality. The third year, it's agriculture. So it's very confusing in a country where the SDGs is not part of the local conversation. It's about job creation and economic growth. SDGs is something foreign and quite colonial for many, even those well-educated entrepreneurs and innovators in Silicon Bongo, great innovation ecosystem in Tanzania. So this is a huge problem, kind of becoming a competition between sustainable business versus sustainable development goals. Then you have the international investors who are struggling too because they are not growing, providing the return on investment that they need for their shareholders, again, as Arthur was also mentioning. Also because there's no investment culture as such in Tanzania. This needs to be kind of learned. And many companies, they kind of, before getting too much profits that they need to pay as taxes, because that comes to someone's pockets, they rather distribute this into the communities, making sure that they contribute to people in their neighborhood. So that's a problem too. They don't know the local way of doing things, the local way of surviving or making money. The third is a very interesting example, and that is, for example, UNSDF, who have made a program in turning Tanzanian wealthy people into investors for these early stage entrepreneurs. And they do so by actually drawing upon the lending and borrowing and saving culture, which is so great in African countries. So they do a collective investment, and this is actually working very well. So these are three kind of attempts of doing blended finance, whereas the two former were not very blended, and the third is kind of being localized, looking into this might actually be something for the longer term. So kind of, I'm not done yet with my research, but I'm in year 3, so I'm getting there, so I can start thinking of what can we learn from this. And I think we just need to be very concrete. We need to jump off the policy conversation as well, and not only stay in the policy conversation. And what we need to see is that we need to keep the two conversation about financing the SDGs versus finance as a tool for development. They are related, but they are separate instruments. One is more backstage, based on a calculation made on what the world needs to pay for getting to the anticipated 2030, which is fine, and finance is important. The other is on the ground. How do we make this work? And we can only get there if we really try to be this concrete and knowing which part of the agenda are we working on now, and when do they match and when do they don't, and when do they feed into each other. So this is kind of a major finding in my research, which I'm diving quite into right now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
Sorry, but if I may jump in,
Yes, sure.
because I think your findings are extremely interesting, and this is really, saying much about there's a lot of discussion on this topic, and there's a lot of policy, and there's a lot of these things, but how does it really work in practice? And this is where I was wondering, because from your research and what you have seen in Tanzania specifically. One thing is what doesn't work, but we want to also, I think all of us are interested in also listening and hearing what could work, and whether there are examples where you see, to have effective blended finance that really works. What are your kind of 2 cents on building these kind of mechanisms or partnerships? What have you seen that you thought this was a good idea? This really works.
It's 2 very simple things. One is it needs to be localized. Yeah. It needs to be driven forward by the people in the country with their knowledge and know-how of their own needs and obstacles. So it needs to be very anchored. And the other is also in a blended. You need to really talk. This is a arranged marriage, isn't it? Like you don't really know each other. You think you talk about the same things. Investor needs to earn money. Development needs to make change. That's 2 very different things, although everyone thinks it's all kind of intertwined as well. And it is, but we need to unfold it. Investor needs to go out of the risks, opportunities, and return on investments framework and develop and look into the messy world out there, which development are very good at structuring and understanding and working for the long-term one. And I think if we get a mutual understanding of those, it works much better. Like the example I gave on the localized way of building up Tanzanian investors based on how you build trust in money through local ways of making money flow. I mean, this is working because this is how things are done there. So it's not not kind of just putting in Silicon Valley instrument into a totally different context. It's never worked in development. We always need to adjust them and see how can this be blooming in this kind of environment, in particular in the least developed countries, which is my focus. I think in the middle income, it's much easier. Like in Nairobi, it's totally different than Dar es Salaam, for example.
Yeah. Thank you, Elisabeth. I would like now to pick up on, I see we have a couple of comments here in the chat, and they seem to be both from NGOs. And I think NGOs often take on a role, and you have examples of private, I would call NGOs kind of public or extended hand of public sector. So the first question here is, what role can you see for NGOs and foundations in blended finance? And how can NGOs contribute to barriers for in the Nordics or what is the question? What barriers do you see for NGOs and foundations in the Nordics right now for doing so? So I think the question is really about what role can they take, and how, of all the challenges and barriers relating to blended finance, is there a niche, a role for NGOs here? So I would like first maybe to hear a bit from Bjorg, her thinking on this, and then I'll let Arthur and Elisabeth also contribute. And we have 15 minutes left of this webinar, so please keep it as brief as you can.
Thank you, Knut, and thanks for that question. I'm just reflecting also on what I heard from the two other speakers. I thought it was very relevant and very interesting input. So let me try to focus what could be, an answer in a quite multifaceted kind of discussion. Clearly, I mean, I come from the development side, but we are trying, and I thought it was interesting to listen to Anita how we try to bring the development actors and the finance actors or investors together and see where we can work together to achieve what I hope is common goals around development, drawing on the strengths of the two different types of actors. Clearly, NGOs are very important in this mix. And there are lots of experiences that NGOs can bring to the table around microfinance. And there are several NGOs that, at least I'm aware of, that have very good, relevant experiences in that area, and that stretch that experience also into working with private sector investors. In particular, again, I mentioned the need for locally led development, and I think Anita articulated that very clearly, that we need to know the context very well to be able to be relevant as partners, and NGOs can really help us with that context understanding. And let me just mention a final point from my perspective as government. We've been working for quite some time to develop a new guarantee mechanism that is now gone live, and we've had our first call for proposals. In developing that, the dialogue with civil society and NGOs was very important in making sure that we, and I know all the NGOs were not entirely happy with the final result, but the input from the NGOs was very important in designing that tool to ensure that we set up a relevant mechanism that also helps us to achieve important development goals. So there's lots to say, but I think I'll limit myself just to those 3 points. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll pose the same question. We have some more questions as well, but Arthur, I know that you have also some experiences with NGOs. How do you see them in the mix, and what kind of role do you think they could take on in this blended finance universe?
Well, again, I think nuances are important. I heard once from a prime minister or something in Tanzania that they had 40,000 NGOs active in that country. I don't know if that number is correct, but I would imagine that there are all kinds of NGOs. I mean, you cannot generalize. And at its best, they provide a lot of insight to us. It's useful for us to learn from them. But they can also, at the other extreme, some might operate in a way that is not necessarily very helpful. For instance, to be a little blunt here, I remember vividly, I was working in another organization, but I was at the time, but when Nordic was launched back in 2008 by Minister Solheim at the time. I mean, that was a big achievement, we felt, a blending of public and private sector. But the comments from a couple of NGOs at the time was the high interest rates we were charging. I mean, they were forgetting about the fact that when we had to charge 30%, the alternatives for the low-income households that we were addressing at the time were typically more than 100%. So we are far from perfect, but would it be better to leave these people to their own devices? I mean, again, we need to balance here. At its best, and most of them are good, decent people, they can give very valuable input to us. Some who are on the crusade, they should hold their horses and be constructive.
Elisabeth, your 2 cents, and please keep it brief, because all of a sudden we have many questions. We need also to go through some of them.
Very brief. It can be a brilliant marriage if the NGO is very clear on their own added value to the partnership and why they believe. They must ask, why is investment a solution to our problem, and how can we contribute to make other people earn money?
Yeah, thank you. That was indeed brief. Well, there are several questions on various issues here, but I would like to pick up, this was posted by WWF Norway, and they have been working apparently with some blended finance mechanisms, and there are several sort of challenges here. One is relating to volume, in terms of we're nowhere near the amount required to actually, it is what Bjorg mentioned, how to fund the SDGs. We are way, way behind in terms of the funds, the money needed, required to achieve the SDGs. There's also pointed out in this comment that the mobilization ratio of private investments remains very low, and particularly low in the most marginalized markets. And I think this is something we most of us are aware of, that LDCs are not that attractive to investors. It's usually lower or middle income countries that constitute the most sort of interesting markets. And then there's also the question of additionality. But I would like to start a bit with that, because obviously, despite good examples and despite institutions like Nordic, already contributing, we're far behind. And there are some really challenges here. It's also pointed out that equity here usually goes to international cooperation. It doesn't necessarily go to the locally based companies. And also there's a comment here on climate focus, that mitigation heavily outweighs adaptation. So yeah, and there are also a couple of other questions here. There's one looking at, it's really basically how can, this is a question for Arthur and Elisabeth, how finance initiatives can be scaled. So I think what many of these questions are touching on is really, what is the problem? Why isn't it being scaled already? If we do know what works and what don't work, why isn't it already being scaled? And I think this time around, I would like to challenge first Arthur and then Elisabeth a bit on what is really the problem? Why isn't this being scaled immediately?
I think, Knut, one issue that is not sufficiently addressed is the fact that, for instance, the deep pockets in Scandinavia, for instance, belonging to the institutional investors, the large pension funds, the large banks, financial institutions, large family offices even, but especially the finance institutions, they are not under the supervision of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Norway. And that's the same holds true also in Denmark and Sweden and Finland, etc. they are under the supervision of Ministry of Finance. And they are heavily restricted by the local financial authorities regarding what they can do with their money. And I think they have their reasons. I mean, these authorities. But it's not the case that the Financial Supervisory Authority in Norway or Denmark, for instance, where our investors come from, it's not the case that they really that they encourage our investors and stakeholders to make the brave step of investing in developing countries. On the contrary, it's very hard for them, for some of these financial institutions, to justify making that brave move. So in spite of all the efforts from Bjorg and her colleagues, excellent colleagues in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, etc., and there are other forces opposing, I would say, or at least questioning the wisdom of using financial sector money for investments in emerging markets, and that's a real problem. That is under-focused. There are reasons why, there are institutional reasons why the financial institutions, for instance, hold back.
Thank you, Arthur. Over to you, Elisabeth. The same question. What are your 2 cents on this?
Yeah, so I'm looking more on the venture capitalists and smaller investors, not the funds or the institutional investors. But I think before we scale, we must make it work. And finance is still a quite early stage instrument in terms of blended finance and development intervention. And as everything else, we need to see how can it be adjusted and put to work to make its cause. So what we have done this far is very much to adopt instruments from the global north and to implement them in the global south with varied success. So we just need to continue to see how can this work for the reasons we want in the blended. I mean, private investors can do whatever they want with the money, but if it's a blended finance project, we need to put in the people's commitments and what we want as a collective. But that takes time. So we need to make it work, then we can scale.
Yeah. And I guess there's also a comment here asking, do we really know enough? Are we, or don't we? Are we thinking we know enough, but we really don't? And it appears from you, Elisabeth, that somehow there's something lacking here about knowledge about this, how this plays out in practice on the ground. Yeah.
Yes, we know very little.
Yeah.
From the research side, at least.
There's also a couple of questions here I wanted to direct in Bjorg's direction. There's one specifically asking whether there are interest from, I guess, the Norwegian government on focusing specifically on Latin America. We talked about the Africa strategy, and we talked, but someone in the audience is curious about this. And then also there's a question here which talks about private sector initiatives with many communities getting access to market and doing business development from their side. How, and this is what we're talking about here is really how can we bridge those needs at the very far end and often remote communities that struggle to make a living with this kind of private sector investors, which is, you know, 2 different universes we are trying here to blend together. So Bjorg, any thoughts on this from your side?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Knut. So in terms of regions, it's true, we saw that need to really put into a new strategy our evolving relationship with the African region. But of course, we are engaged in other regions as well. One of the challenges, I think, with this discussion, it touches on your second point, Knut, is that we are really talking about several different things at the same time. So the kind of initiatives that we can engage in as as government are on many different levels through many different partners, and we try to address different challenges with the different initiatives and the different tools. I know that you are aware of that, but I would like to have mentioned it. For example, in this area of blended finance and trying to marry, our government funding with private capital, the development banks are very important partners to us. So we know the World Bank, but of course the Inter-American Development Bank is an important partner in the Latin American region. Just mentioning that because it was raised, and the regional banks and other banks are important partners to us. I would like to mention Norfund as well. We've mentioned investments in blended finance and also investments in the climate sector, where Norfund and the new climate investment fund has been quite successful, I think, and taught us some lessons on how we can be involved, but again, at quite at the large scale projects. And then we might need to think about the different partners and tools to get to communities. And there may be, coming from the development side, some sectors, renewable energy, for example, aspects of food production and agriculture, food security, which is another priority for us that might be maybe more ripe for this kind of interventions. And then there may be other sectors or communities where we use other tools in our development toolbox to try to help improve people's lives. I'd just like to bring that into our discussion as well. But looking at the time, let me end with just saying that we remain committed to keep discussing about how we can be useful and spend the development finance that we have to leverage investments from the private sector, from the very local, from the small businesses that create jobs and improve lives in communities, to the more larger schemes, and then recognizing that we need maybe to work with different partners and in different ways to achieve those the different goals.
Yeah.
Thank you.
In short, it's quite complex, but we have to think about the entire toolbox. We are coming to an end, but before that, I think you actually answered my planned last question, Bjorg, and I want to give Arthur and Elisabeth the same chance to give one example of where you've really seen that this works, where objectives are aligned, where the money is really contributing to positive, good social impact, environmental impact, and the structuring of that partnership. If you can give us sort of insight on a positive note, how can this work in practice as you're with a limited time available. But Arthur, any sort of concrete example comes to mind?
Yeah, well, again, I mentioned already 2 out of 3 blended finance instruments that we are fortunate to have at Nordic. We have mentioned the foreign exchange currency facility that provides insurance for large unexpected currency losses. And I also briefly touched upon the technical assistance facility that has also been provided by the Norwegian government. It's managed by Nordic. Those have been great for us. I mean, for each dollar or Norwegian krone that has been provided through those facilities, we have been able to mobilize from 15 to 20 kroner from the private sector, depending on how you count. So that is being additional, isn't it, and catalytic. And we are also a recent example known from Asia, from the project I mentioned in the rainforest of Borneo, where the Temasek Foundation, part of the Temasek family or the family of companies in Singapore, they are provided a credit loss facility that makes it possible for us to give these long-term loans to palm oil farmers in Indonesia. So they prefer to stay on their current plots and farm there instead of venturing into the rainforest. And both those things are, all those three facilities have worked very well for us and shows that it's possible to make blended finance work.
Thank you, Arthur. We're a bit above time, but I still want to give time to you, Elisabeth. Your 2 cents. What would you recommend, or as a concrete example on a good blended finance collaboration?
I would say what I've seen donors funding the Tanzania Startup Association in Tanzania seem to be very, very efficient. It's building upon their own competence and needs, and then building a strong ecosystem for themselves, whom again brings the government into the conversations, which is needed for changes in policies, regulations, enabling in these kind of investments we want to for these entrepreneurs. So again, building upon the strengths, the needs, and the very, very strong skilled people who are already doing a lot of this work. For me, it's quite amazing to see and totally needed to make capital work as also investments and not only savings and loans.
Good, thank you. This, I think, was the last remark from, we have time to allow for the panel, which is very unfortunate because this is such an interesting and complex topic. And there are many other, and my apologies to the audience that we couldn't go through all the questions. Additionality is also, a very important part of this discussion. But I guess this recording will be made available, and we do have from our side, Future Horizons Institute, we have a series of webinars on various topics. So please follow us on LinkedIn or our homepage. If you want to get in touch, please feel free to reach out. We would love to have a much longer discussion on this very important topic. But thank you so much to the panel, and thank you to all the participants. And I hope you have a nice day and a nice week. Thank you.